Okay, this is the seventh week. We're going to tackle Chapter 7, Living in Multicultural Worlds. There you go. Winter scene. I understand you guys just got snow, so there you go. Acculturation is the process by which people migrate to and learn a culture that's different from their original or heritage culture, and that's known as acculturation. Moving to a new culture involves psychological adjustment. This adjustment occurs over a wide variety of domains: acquiring a new language, learning new interpersonal and social behaviors, becoming accustomed to new values, becoming a member of a minority group, adjusting one's self-concept. Leisgard in 1955 tracked a number of Norwegian Fulbright scholars in the United States. In the first few months of their experiences, the migrants were having an especially positive time in their visit. They were enjoying the experiences, meeting new people, trying new foods, communicating with people in a foreign language, and feeling the excitement of participating in a novel and exotic environment. This is in 1955. Oberg in 1960 referred to the first few months as the honeymoon stage. It is the existence of the honeymoon stage that keeps the tourism trade in business. Most travelers do not stay in a new culture long enough to move past this stage, and they thus tend to view their experiences in new cultures to be, for the most part, pleasant and exciting. So if you're one of those people that has traveled to different places and thought it was just wonderful, maybe you need to spend a little bit more time there. Having been in the military, normally our tours were anywhere from 6 months to 7 years, 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 or 7 years. So we got to learn about where we were because they kept us there for an extended length of time. Following the honeymoon stage, most visitors turn a corner and begin to have increasingly negative views of their host culture. And this is what Leisgard found in 1955. Between 6 and 18-month visitors experience the most negative feelings of their sojourn in a stage that has been labeled the crisis or culture shock stage. In the culture shock stage, the thrill of having novel and exotic experiences wears off, and these experiences become tiring and difficult. At this stage, recent migrants often realize their language skills are not yet good enough for them to fully function in the new environment. During the culture shock stage, the migrant realizes that they do not have a rich enough understanding of how the system works to thrive. The people they initially met who were interested in them because they were exotic and different are no longer so interested in those differences. Recent migrants may also be discovering that the television programs just aren't as interesting as the ones they used to see in their home country, and they start to miss their favorite foods. This is the time that homesickness can become very strong. Culture shock is the feeling of being anxious, helpless, irritable, and in general homesick that one experiences after moving to a new culture. The symptoms of culture shock includes missing your close friends and family, missing the little things about being back home, like conversations with bus drivers, eating your favorite snacks. A sojourner in culture shock may wallow in the crisis stage for several months, and then start to adjust and begin to enjoy their experiences more. Their language abilities improve, enabling them to function better in their daily lives. Eventually, sojourners become better able to make enduring friendships with the locals, and they adapt to things in the new culture, such as TV programming and the food, so that these no longer felt strange. They had started thinking more and more like the locals around them. This stage, labeled the adjustment stage, tends to extend over a number of years. People become more and more proficient at functioning in their new culture. Oh, I guess this guy's joined the group. He's even painted like everybody else. Guess which one of these ladies is doesn't belong to the group? Well, since everybody else is not wearing a top and this one is wearing a top, I would guess that this is probably the lady who doesn't belong. And I've got one more, and this has nudity in it as well. There you go. Two really upset people. One is this lady right here, and the other one is this guy right here. And here she is wandering around without a top on, just like everybody else in the group, just like all the women in the group, but she's not as nearly as accepted. Trying to fit in. Trying to fit in. This thing that she's holding on to is a neck rest. You can see there's a little divot right here. It's used instead of a pillow. Sojourners may go through the same adjustment stages when they return home. Initially, people are elated to see their families and friends again and to be able to eat their favorite foods. It is not uncommon for people to soon experience reverse culture shock and find themselves puzzling over why they did not quite feel at home anymore and why they feel somewhat alienated from those around them. They don't feel like they are a good fit anymore. This is something that happened to me when I was in the military. I would go home and visit my parents, and suddenly I didn't have the accent that everybody else had. Hoosiers do have an accent, and I didn't have a Hoosier accent anymore, or not nearly as much as they did. And people would say I was putting on airs because I had changed the way that I talk. And of course, I really didn't do that on purpose. It was just something that kind of happened. Japan is a country that is relatively ethnically homogenous. 98% of the people living in Japan are Japanese. So the probability that you're seeing somebody who's Japanese when you're in Japan is extremely high because only 2% of the population is not Japanese, are not ethnically Japanese. Regardless of how well people learn the customs or master the language, they will always stand out as different from the other 98% who are ethnically Japanese. Cao Ying in 1995 tracked the acculturation experiences of a few hundred migrants to Japan, but didn't find the pattern that Leisgard had seen in 1955. Instead of a U-shaped curve where things start out great, get worse, and then recover, the researchers discovered a rather pessimistic L-shaped curve where things stay bad. Now, you got to remember that Leisgard was talking about Norwegians who would come to the United States. Now, one of the things that, of course, if you're indigenous, then you understand that the United States is actually a nation of immigrants. So there are a lot of people around, and everybody has changed from their culture, whether they're the first or second or third generation or fourth or fifth or sixth generation. They started out as somebody else from a different country, and they came to the United States. So in the United States, it's real easy to kind of fit in because nobody actually there isn't anything specific that is American. I mean, the American culture is very confused. It's very eclectic. But in Japan, everything is the same because in Japan, 98% of the people there are Japanese. And the Japanese have very strict ways of acting and being. So in the United States, if you go to New York, they're going to act one way. If you go to Chicago, it's another way. If you go to Cincinnati, it'll be something else. You go to Los Angeles, it's totally different. If you go to Arizona, up on the reservation, it's one way. Down in Phoenix, it's another way. There's a lot of variability in the United States. In Japan, it's not that way. Cao Ying in 1995 discovered that people who have been in Japan for 5 years were just as negative toward Japan as those who had been there for just over a year. They all seemed in the depths of the crisis stage, or they were having culture shock. I was there. I was in Japan for 6 months, and I can tell you that it gets pretty depressing. For one thing, in Japan, they there's a lot. They eat a lot of seafood, and I can't eat seafood. So we had to do all of our shopping on the base. That's the only place we could get beef or pork or chicken. They don't really grow chicken. They don't really have the territory to grow anything except to find their protein out in the ocean. So it was really kind of interesting. I also didn't really have anything to do. It took a while to find a job on base, and just as I found a job, then my wife was reassigned to the United States. As strange as that was, so I wasn't really that happy with being in Japan. That and the fact that the Japanese don't really treat you very well. But then again, I'm used to being I was used to being an outsider because I was an outsider in Oklahoma. I was an outsider in well, I was obviously an outsider on the Navajo reservation, but I hadn't been there yet. I was an outsider in Ohio. I'm from Indiana, not from Ohio. I was an outsider in Texas. I was an outsider in Germany. I was an outsider in North Texas. I was an outsider in South Texas. I've always been an outsider because we've never actually been stationed in Indiana. Did I get it right? Yeah. The author speculates that the adjustment phase starts somewhere around 5, but before the 10-year point. So you have to live in Japan for at least 10 years. You have to learn the language. They've actually got 3 different alphabets. It's really difficult to learn Japanese. The Japanese are very specific about how you act and what you say and who you can look at and who you can't look at. And they don't really see people from outside as becoming Japanese because Japanese people are very specific. Uh, and since 98% of the population is ethnically Japanese, it's not difficult for them to see somebody who's not Japanese as a complete outsider. That includes people from Korea. Interestingly, they brought Koreans into Japan to act as servants when they controlled Japan or when they controlled Korea. But even the Koreans, who are also Asians, are rejected as gaijin. Gaijin means somebody from outside. Cultural distance is the difference between cultures in their overall ways of life. We can hypothesize that the more cultural distance someone needs to travel, the more difficulty that person will have acculturating. And these are Sikhs. Sikhs are from India. It is a specific religious group. They always wear turbans. They never cut their hair, and they grow beards. I ran into a Sikh in Paris. It's really kind of interesting. Um, they're big. They're really tall people, and I'm not very big. And the Sikhs tend to be really tall and strong. They also have to always carry a knife. This guy's got his sword. If we could see their belts, we would see that each of them had some kind of a sword. This is a symbol of the Sikhs. There are various measures that can be used to determine acculturation across cultures. One indirect measure is language performance. Several studies show that the best predictors of acculturative success is language ability. So if you can speak the language, then you're probably going to be better off than people who can't speak the language. And that's according to Gullahorn and Gullahorn in 1963, and then Ying and Lisi in 1991. Knowles and colleagues in 1996 speculated that the greater the confidence in the mastery of the host country's language, the greater the identity with the culture. Many researchers have found a connection between language skill and success acculturating. My dad was in World War II, and during World War II, he landed at Normandy, on day 3, and then they wandered their way through France and into Germany, into Belgium, and then into Germany. One of the things he found while they were fighting in France was that the French people didn't really treat him very well. So when I was stationed in Germany, they came over and we took a trip to Paris. We took a trip to France, Metz and Biche and Paris. And my dad was really upset because the French treated them so bad. He said now he remembered why he didn't like the French during the war. But then again, we can't speak French. Even people that could speak English would try to force you to speak French before they spoke English. When foreign students seek entry into the United States universities, they are required to take the TOEFL, the test of English as a foreign language. Research shows that individuals who came from countries that are similar to English, such as the Dutch and the Germans, perform better than those who grew up speaking other European languages that are a little more distant, such as the Romance languages, French and Spanish. So it's a little bit easier for people who speak Dutch and German. Anglo-Saxon, the Anglo part of Anglo and Saxon are both Germanic languages. So there are a lot of words that are very similar in German and in Dutch. So they have a little bit easier time learning English than people from France and from Spain. According to the Educational Testing Service, which administers the TOEFL, speakers of Indo-European languages tend to perform better on the TOEFL than those who speak languages from highly distant language groups such as Kazakh or Japanese. And these people are Kazakhs from Kazakhstan. Cultural distance encapsulates more than just language. Many other skills must be mastered when people move to a new culture. Ward and Kennedy in 1995 compared the adjustment of Malaysian university students in New Zealand, a culture that is quite different from their own despite the not so distant proximity, and a group of Malaysian students in Singapore, which has a similar culture. Singapore is right here. This is Singapore right, well, if you could see it. Anyway, Singapore's right there. So as you can see, it's part of Malaysia. The students completed a measure of cultural adjustment that assessed their daily problems in navigating through the new culture. After spending almost 3 years in the two countries, the Malaysian students who were studying in Singapore reported having fewer difficulties than those who were studying in New Zealand. And of course, we found out where New Zealand's way down here, and Singapore's right there. And this is where Malaysia is. This chunk of stuff right here, of land right here, is Malaysia. Sojourners from more distant cultures suffer more distress. Wait a second, did I finish it? Yeah. Sojourners from more distant cultures suffer from more distress, require more medical consultations, and have more social difficulties in general than those who traverse less cultural distances. And this is according to Babaker et al. In 1980 and Furnham and Bachner in 1982. Some indigenous Canadian tribes, such as the Tsimshian of the Northwest Pacific Coast region, engaged in subsistence practices, primarily fishing for salmon and shellfish, that allowed them to accumulate large quantities of food and establish permanent, highly stratified settlements long before they had any contact with the Europeans. We know the Tsimshian because they're the ones that carve the totem poles. They are totem pole carvers in the Northwest. The Eastern Cree live just below the tree line in northern Quebec, and of course, northern Quebec is closer to the Atlantic Ocean. The Tsimshian were on the Pacific coast. They engage in subsistence practices, hunting in the winter and fishing in the summer, which does not allow them to accumulate much food. So some of the bands are migratory and have low sociocultural stratification. The carrier, or Atlashima, or the Athabascan-speaking group, live on the Rocky Mountain Plateau of northern British Columbia, also engage in hunting and fishing like the Eastern Cree. These are the individuals that are probably related to the Dene. Some of them refer to themselves as Dene instead of Dene, but they are Athabascan-speaking peoples. But because they have the possibility of accumulating large numbers of salmon at the headwaters of some rivers, and because their culture was influenced geographically close to the Tsimshian, the carrier represent a culture with a moderate degree of food accumulation and social stratification. So we have very little social stratification with the Cree. We have moderate social stratification and food accumulation with the carrier, and we have a great deal of social stratification and food accumulation with the Tsimshian. Berrien and Niths in 1974 speculated that the more stratified the culture, the more similar they were to a European culture, the easier it would be to acculturate to the European dominance. The Tsimshian acculturated the easiest, the Eastern Cree had the most stress in acculturating, and the carrier were somewhere in between. Cultural fit is the degree to which an individual's personality is more similar to the dominant cultural values in the host culture. It would seem that the greater the cultural fit of a person with the host culture, the more easily he or she should acculturate to it. And this is a dancer, powwow dancer from Canada, and so are these guys. These guys are Indigenous First Nation people from Canada. People who score high on extroversion are more likely to move to other countries, particularly to urban areas, when compared with those who are less extroverted. Some researchers have proposed that because extroversion should facilitate communication everywhere, extroverts should always fare better in the acculturation experience compared with introverts. The study in New Zealand found that Malaysians high on the extroversion scale showed more signs of well-being than those who scored low. However, English-speaking expatriates in Singapore who scored high on the extroversion scale reported more depression, boredom, frustration, and health problems. And the reason for that is because that does not fit with the Singaporean personality. Singaporean personality is more collectivist. It's more introverted, and because they didn't really fit in very well, despite the fact that they spoke the language fairly well, they could not fit in to the culture because of their personality traits. Extroversion does not always facilitate acculturation. It appears that an extroverted personality makes a better cultural fit in New Zealand than it does in Singapore, and extroverts will fare better in the acculturation experience only when they fit in well with the culture. Highly extroverted immigrants fare better in terms of their well-being when they immigrate to countries with overall more pronounced levels of extroversion. People with more independent self-concepts have been found to suffer less distress in acculturating to the United States than people with more interdependent self-concepts and people who have patterns of emotions that are more similar to those with the host culture report experiencing greater relational well-being. One acculturation strategy is that people need to participate in the larger society of their host culture. Are the people motivated to acquire an identity consistent with that of the host culture? Are these people striving to maintain their own heritage, culture, and identity as members of that culture? Do people have positive attitudes toward their heritage culture? And are they actively seeking ways to preserve the traditions of their heritage culture? Now, this is really kind of interesting because as a military person, or as somebody that traveled around because of the military, one of the things that we had to do when we moved from one place to the other was we had to fit in with our new culture. So we moved to Mississippi, we were in Texas, we were in California twice. I went to Ohio. We were in Nebraska. We moved to Montana. We moved to Germany. We moved to Japan. My wife was in Korea. We were in Washington, D.C. So the question is, how do you fit in? And the question I asked myself when I first started in the military was, do I want to act like somebody from Indiana, or do I want to change my personality, change the way that I speak, change my ideas to fit in with the people that I was around now? That would be Texas and Ohio and Germany. So did I change? Did I change who I was so that I would fit in better with the people that I was around? And I can remember asking myself this question as soon as I left Indiana. I asked myself, do I want to fit in, or do I want to be myself and try to adapt my personality to be able to get along with people, but not to change my personality? And I remember thinking about this the very first time that I moved from one place to the other. As we talk about, if you take social psychology from me, which right now I'm not teaching social psychology, but if you take social psychology from me, you'll find out that that when my culture tried to change me, I decided that I was not going to change. I was going to be the person that I already was. I wasn't going to change myself just to fit in. And one of the questions that came up had to do with religion. When I was in grade school, we had Bible school in school. This was back in the 1950s, or the middle 1950s, late 1950s. So we were supposed to go to Bible study every Thursday at the church right across from the grade school. And I refused to go. And I was the only one. In the beginning, I was the only one that refused to go. Everybody else went, whether there were Catholics that went. There were different denominations of people that went, but everybody were Christians, and they went to Bible study. And I said, I don't really go to church, and I don't really want to go. And I was the only one that didn't go. Then the next year, another person joined me who also didn't go to church. Decided that they didn't want to go either, so we didn't go. As long as we were in the elementary school. After that, after the fifth grade, we moved to the high school, which was too far away for them to try to pull us into this Bible study thing. But my brothers and sisters, they all had to do exactly the same thing. They didn't go to church either, but they went to Bible study on Thursdays, because just to fit in. So they were willing to change who they were, or at least to change who they seemed to be, in order to acculturate themselves with the other people. And I didn't. I refused to do that. So when I joined the military, of course I went to college for 4 years, and once I joined the military, I asked myself, what do I want to do? Do I want to fit in, or do I want to be myself? And what I decided very consciously was that I didn't really want to change who I was. I liked who I was, and I didn't really want to change. So one of the the first time I got in trouble when I was in the military was that every Sunday, of course, we were supposed to go to church. And I told them I didn't go to church. And he said, well, no, we don't have any atheists in the military. And I told him, I'm not going to go to church. And he said, well, like I said, there aren't any atheists in my unit. And I told him, I'm not going to church. Which one would I go to? Since I don't believe in any of these churches, which one would I go to? And he said, well, you have a choice. You can either go to church, or you can clean the latrine. And I said, well, I'll clean the latrine. And he said, you'll clean the latrine with your toothbrush. And so for the next 8 weeks of basic training, for all 8 weeks of basic training on Sunday, while everybody else was at church, I was cleaning. I cleaned the latrine with my toothbrush. And we were only allowed one toothbrush, so I also had to brush my teeth with that same toothbrush that I cleaned the bathroom with. Why did he do it? He did it because he was trying to force me into going to church, but I didn't. I didn't. Okay, so yeah, maybe there is something wrong with me. Maybe I need to be a little bit more flexible. But the reality was, I asked myself this question, and now we're going to talk about acculturation strategies. Another strategy of acculturation involves attempts to fully participate in the host culture while at the same time striving to maintain the traditions of one's heritage culture. And this is known as the integration strategy. People using this strategy have positive views toward both their heritage and their host culture. They are seeking the best of both worlds. And of course, this is, I've always been respectful of where I've been and the people that I'm around, but I've never tried to change to be like them. I've never worn a kimono in Japan. I didn't wear cowboy boots in Texas. The strategy that involves little or no effort to participate in the host culture or to maintain the traditions of the heritage culture is known as the marginalization strategy. People using this strategy have negative views toward both their heritage and their host cultures. This strategy may be something pursued more by people who have grown up in multiple cultures across their childhood. So these individuals are not only rejecting their host culture, but they're also rejecting their childhood culture. Some individuals who have grown up in multiple cultures are sometimes termed as third culture kids, and thus will identify themselves as global citizens. Some researchers do not accept marginalization as a legitimate acculturation strategy, but as a form of neuroticism, because you don't have any culture at all. And the reality is, we all come from a culture. The question is, do we how strongly do we adhere to it is the question. The assimilation strategy involves an attempt to fit in and fully participate in the host culture while making little or no effort to maintain the traditions of one's heritage culture. It involves having positive attitudes toward the heritage culture. It reflects a desire to leave behind the ancestral past so as to fit in with the host culture. And this is what the United States was trying to do with the American Indian groups that they encountered. They wanted them to assimilate. They not only wanted the indigenous people to assimilate to the American culture, which didn't really exist at this time. But they wanted the people coming in from the immigrants coming in. Now, you got to remember that we had huge influxes of immigrants coming to the United States up until the 1920s, from the 18th century, which that's the 1700s, all the way to 1920. We had just a massive influx of immigrants. As a matter of fact, between 1880 and 1920, 60% of all of the people that immigrated to the United States immigrated to the United States in that 60-year period, that 40-year period. 1880 to 1920. We had huge masses of people coming in from Eastern Europe, people coming in from Southern Europe, Greek and Italians. We had people coming in from Hungary and from the old Austrian Empire. Lots of people coming in. And we were trying to force them, we as Americans, people that were in charge, the Americans were trying to educate these individuals. And they educated the individuals by using schools. So they had requirements, mandatory requirements, that everybody went to school. Now, why in the world did they do that? The answer, this cost them money. But the reason they wanted to do that was because there were different ideas coming in from Europe, and they wanted to force these individuals to think like Americans. And that's what the educational structure was all about. They were forcing the people coming in who had ideas about being monarchists, potentially being Bolsheviks, being negative about democracy. We were trying to force them to think like Americans, and that's where the educational system came from. Now, at the same time, they were doing the same thing with the indigenous people, with the boarding schools. So one of the reasons why the boarding schools were acceptable to the federal government, even though it cost them a lot of money, they were trying to assimilate all the American Indians into this idea of American democracy. Um, and it's one of the reasons why it took so long for them to accept indigenous peoples as American citizens because of this idea that they couldn't, that it was difficult for them to change their ideas. And it wasn't until the second generation of boarding school people that they actually um, allowed the indigenous peoples in the United States to become citizens, and that happened in the 1920s. The boarding schools started in the late 1870s, so the first generation went to the boarding schools up to the 1900s, the second generation up to 1920, and by the second generation, they felt like there were enough people with the idea that the United States democracy was the way to go. They felt that they had assimilated all of these individuals by forcing them to lose their language and to learn English and to learn a new trade. They were doing exactly the same thing with the immigrants. So it was a strategy. It was an assimilation strategy that they were using with new people or with people that had been here, of course, but people that didn't have the American ideal. The separation strategy involves efforts to maintain the traditions of the heritage culture while making little or no effort to participate in the host culture. This strategy is composed of positive attitudes toward the heritage culture and negative attitudes toward the host culture. People pursuing separation strategies do not wish to acculturate to the host culture. The most common strategy people pursue is the integration strategy. The least common strategy is the marginalization strategy. Marginalization has to do with rejecting your heritage culture and rejecting the host culture and having no culture. And people really can't survive unless they have an idea about who they are and where they come from. A person will not strive to fit into the host culture if the culture shows a good deal of prejudice toward the individual's own cultural group. And this has been a problem. Has been one of the reasons why it has been difficult for African Americans to accept, um, to assimilate to the American ideal. It's a reason why indigenous peoples have had a difficult time assimilating. It's because the host culture, especially the people in the area around them, seem to have a great deal of prejudice. When I was living in Montana, the largest city near us was Havre, Montana, and Montana was adjudged to be the most prejudiced city in the United States. In Havre, Havre's right on the Canadian border, and they would have signs, the Canadians welcome, but they didn't have any signs that said American Indians welcome, even though they had Fort Belknap and Rocky Boy, Stonechild. Wait a minute, Stonechild's a college. Rocky Boy's a reservation. Okay, Rocky Boy was on one side of Havre, and the Fort Belknap reservation was on the other. So they were they were on two sides, east and west. They had Indian reservations, but they weren't welcoming to American Indians. However, at one time it had a fairly significant Chinese population, and at this when I was there, there were no Chinese in Havre. What had happened to them? Well, if you read the history of Montana, there was open season on the Chinese immigrants that were trying to move into the United States or just to survive in the United States. And these individuals, they either were driven out or were killed. People who have physical features that distinguish them from the majority of those in the host culture will likely experience more prejudice than people who have physical features that allow them to blend in with their host culture. More physically distinct ethnic groups are more likely to maintain negative attitudes toward the host culture and pursue separation or marginalization strategies. You can take this to the bank as much as you want. The more you look like the dominant culture, the more likely that you're going to be acceptable. Once upon a time in the United States, right after the 1920s, people coming from Southern Europe had black hair. They were Catholic. They were fairly pale. Their complexion was relatively pale. But these individuals were rejected because of their black hair and because of their religion. Eventually, all of this went away, and this prejudice they had against people from Greece and people from Italy, people with black hair, went away during World War II because everybody needed to, or everybody joined the army, or they were drafted into the military and they went overseas and they all fought together. And it's really difficult for you to reject the man standing beside you who saved your life or who's protected you or had your back. And eventually, of course, it was difficult to tell if somebody was Italian or if somebody was Greek or if somebody was, Slovenian or Slovakian or whatever. Whereas before, people were trying to identify people as English or French or German or whatever. And now all of a sudden, that was all gone. Looking at these five ladies here, if we look at them, you can't tell whether anybody's from Sweden or Germany or if they have Italian ancestry or whatever. You might guess that this lady is a little bit darker. She has black hair. She's a little bit darker complexioned. Where is she from? Well, she could be from southern Germany. She could be French. She could be Belgian. She could be Italian. She could be Greek. She could be from Turkey. It's impossible to tell. Physically distinct ethnic groups are more likely to actively support collective efforts to benefit their group's social position. People who are of lower socioeconomic status or who are members of indigenous cultural groups are more likely to pursue separation or marginalization strategies because the host culture does not typically offer them much that they desire. The extent to which majority members of the host culture value cultural diversity and tolerance of cultural differences also predicts the amount of prejudice that immigrants experience. When host cultures promote tolerance for diversity and multiculturalism, migrants are more likely to adopt more positive attitudes toward the host culture, which increases the likelihood that they will pursue integration or assimilation strategies. Now, the reality is that immigrants coming into the United States, and of course, immigrants have been coming into the United States for 300 or 400 years. Immigrants coming into the United States, if they come from someplace that has low socioeconomic status, they were probably thought of as fairly negatively. In other words, there were prejudices against them. There were prejudices against people from Ireland, people from Poland, people from Italy, people from Greece, people from Eastern Europe, Hungarians, Slovenians, Slovakians. But usually this went away as soon as people lost their identity as Italian or Irish or whatever. I have Irish ancestry myself. And when the Irish first started coming into the United States, people referred to them as drunks. They referred to them as black Irish because they had negative attitudes toward these individuals. But the reality is that I don't identify myself as Irish because because all my ancestry is white, and being from Ireland is not a negative thing at this juncture. But in the 19th century, being from Ireland was a very negative thing, and could mean that you didn't get a job just because of your Irish heritage. When I was working in Oklahoma, we had a lady that came in whose name was spelled Roarke. Now, if that's a name from Great Britain, Roarke. Uh, if you live in Ireland, it's pronounced Rourke or O'Rourke. It's a good Irish name, but if the name is in England, it's pronounced Roark to differentiate it from the Irish pronunciation. So when I was working in Oklahoma, I was working in a rural health clinic, and I would have to call the patients back. So one time this lady came in, and her name was Roarke. Well, I know how to pronounce a name. It was Rourke because I had seen it over and over and over again. Well, this lady just about tore my head off because I had pronounced it the Irish way instead of the English way. She claimed to be her name was Roark, but of course her husband had come in at some point, and I had called him Rourke, and he had no problem with it because he recognized they were from the South. So they wanted to be they were from the South, and she wanted to be English, and he didn't really care. So he didn't mind being called Rourke, but she just about took my head off because I had pronounced her name in the Irish fashion. The acculturation strategy that one adopts might vary across situations. Turkish immigrants in the Netherlands often show an integration strategy in public situations where they act in the mainstream of Dutch ways, yet some will simultaneously show a separation strategy in private, rejecting mainstream Dutch ways when they are in an entirely Turkish immigrant situation. And this is according to research done by Aaron's Toth and Van de Veer. And if we look at these individuals, these are all fans of the Netherlands. You can tell by their orange outfits. That is the national color of Ireland, or of Netherlands, is orange. But if we look at these 6 women, yeah, if we look at the 6 of them, 2 of them are from Turkey, and I would bet that you can probably tell which ones are from Turkey. It's these 2 right here, of course, these 2 with black hair. And if we look at these 2 ladies, look how blue her eyes are and how blue her eyes are. Her eyes are brown, but one of the things we know about people from the Netherlands is that they are the tallest people in the world. Women, the average height for women is 5'10", and the average height for men is 6'1". And here are these 2 short Turkish women. The 4 acculturation strategies, assimilation, integration, separation, and marginalization, are hypothesized to yield different outcomes in the acculturation process. The strategy that is hypothesized to result in the lowest degree of acculturative stress is the integration strategy, and much research shows that this strategy yields the most favorable outcomes. The integration strategy, accepting the heritage culture and the host culture at the same time. Sometimes immigrants will adopt the fast food eating habits of Americans. Among immigrants who have lived in the United States for less than a year, 8% were obese. Among those who had been here for 15 years, 19% were obese. This percentage approaches the obesity rate for American-born residents at 22%. When an immigrant or a minority member does not fit the prototype of their host culture, people might question their identity. This is called identity denial. Their identity is called into question because they do not seem to match the prototype of the culture. And these are two good examples. This is Halle Berry. Halle Berry's mother is English and her father is African American. She grew up in the Cleveland area. And this is James Franco. His father was Portuguese and Swedish, and his mother was a Russian Jew. Is a Russian Jew, and he adheres to his Russian culture, but he's relatively dark complexioned, like people from Portugal. So the question is, what culture do they adhere to? And of course, Halle Berry is of mixed race, and potentially, I guess you could say James Franco is too. His parents are not from the same cultural group. So which culture do they adhere to? Does Halle Berry adhere to the white culture or the black culture? Does James Franco adhere to the Portuguese or the Jewish, Russian Jewish culture? And the answer is, as far as James Franco is concerned, he doesn't adhere to any culture, and Halle Berry adheres to the black culture. Even though her African American father left when she was 4 years old, and he is completely estranged from her, despite the fact she was raised by a white mother who was from England, not from the United States, she still adheres to her African American heritage. In 1992, Steele identified a phenomenon that had puzzled psychometricians for decades: what was causing highly qualified African American students to do worse in their studies. Steele's hypothesis is referred to as stereotype threat, the fear that one might do something that will inadvertently confirm a negative stereotype about one's group. Stereotype threat. After achieving acculturation, an immigrant becomes bicultural. The tendency for bicultural people to evince psychological tendencies between those of their two cultures is called blending. The individual tends to switch between different cultural selves in a process known as frame switching or alternation. Inner city children, especially minorities, quickly learn to discriminate between the norms and unwritten rules that govern their schools and mainstream society and those that govern the streets. Code switching is an essential skill for inner city children to learn if they are to survive and succeed in these two divergent cultural contexts. So when they go to school, they have to act one way. When they're out on the streets, they act a totally different way. Now, I taught this class when I was when I was teaching at Ashford. A lot of my students were from Chicago, and right now Hispanic gangs are fairly prevalent in Chicago. And I had one student that told me the most god-awful story about how when he went to school, he wanted to succeed. He wanted to get out of the negative environment that he was in, and the way he did that was by joining a gang in order to be protected when he was out on the street. He joined. He was a good soccer player, so he joined the soccer team, and he did well in school. But when he was out on the street, he had to speak completely differently. He had to speak Spanish. And when he was out on the soccer field, he had to act like he was an athlete and didn't care about his grades. So he was constantly code switching between being a gang member, being a nerd, and being an athlete. It was really tough for him because he became very adept at it. Um, and Anyway, he was a kind of an amazing kid. Um, his gang, uh, another individual that was there, was in a rival gang, and they were really good friends at Ashford because they could be friends at Ashford, and they were from a similar area, and they would ride together to go home, but one of them would have to get out of the car before they got to, the enemy's territory because he couldn't be seen in the other guy's territory. But they were really good friends at Ashford. I mean, the code switching was just this constant interplay of what was going on. Now the problem was these two guys were pretty good friends. They weren't really, they roomed beside each other, but not with each other. And if somebody else who was Hispanic from Chicago came to the school, they had to sound him out in order to figure out how to act in his presence. It was really an interesting time. Anderson argues that such children must learn to switch between code of the decent and the code of the street as they deal with people in their school culture and their street culture. And of course, this is what he had to do. But he also had to determine how to act when he was playing soccer, because now he had to be three different people. He had to be a nerd, he had to be a soccer jock, he had to be a jock, and he had to be a gang member just in order to survive. The code of the street permeates many aspects of life, in particular, the development of a reputation that one is tough and is not to be messed with. And of course, that's the reason he joined the gang, because he was small, he was relatively small. And if they had found out that he was a jock, if he had been identified as a jock, then potentially somebody would have tried to break his leg or break his ankle or shoot him in the leg, just because they were trying to keep him from being who they didn't like. Multiculturals engage in frame switching through the language that they speak. The language that people speak seems to activate an associated cultural network, and this influences how they think. When bilinguals switch between languages, they're not just bringing different vocabularies and grammars to mind, they seem to be bringing different selves to mind as well. And you potentially can identify with this if you are a native Dene speaker. Researchers found that people who had lived in more than one culture were more likely to come up with outside-the-box creative solutions to a problem than those who lived in only one culture. This is really kind of amazing, because if you live in just one culture, you have a specific way of thinking, and it's the acceptable way of thinking. Now, one of the amazing things about my student was that he was a very innovative person. And one of the reasons he was so innovative was because he had to live three different lives. And this gave him the concept of, this is what it's like to be an athlete, this is what it's like to be a Hispanic member of a gang, and this is what it's like to be an academic in Chicago. And because of that, he had a very innovative way of thinking. He wasn't just stuck as a sporto. He wasn't just stuck as a gang member. He wasn't just stuck as an academician. He was all three of those, and he could switch from place to place. One of the interesting things that happened well, we won't go into that. I gave him a shirt, and he was so appreciative. But as a sporto, he wouldn't have been appreciative. But it was in an academic situation, and because of that, he could act more happier that I gave him the shirt. It was an athletic shirt, and I gave it to him in class, or before class actually, because he had talked about it, and he had been sitting in the stands watching. He was a male. Well, he was a male, obviously. We was watching the women's team, and he had just said that just to be a smartass, I guess. But when I gave it to him, he realized that it was genuine. That he was just trying to make fun of me for wearing an athletic shirt, and it just changed his whole outlook of what was going on. Now, this is really kind of interesting that if you have if you allow yourself to be in two different cultures at the same time, if you have lived in another culture, that it gives you a different way of thinking. It gives you permission to think in a different way. If you've only lived one place in your whole life and have never lived anyplace else, then you only have one way of thinking. And this is according to research by Maddox and Galinsky in 2009. Maddox and Galinsky in 2009 further found that those who had merely visited other cultures as tourists did not show any comparative creative advantage. Visiting other cultures is quite different from living in another culture because the former does not involve any adjustment on the part of the individual. But if you live in that culture, if you become accustomed to being in that culture, you gain their way of thinking. You accept their way of thinking because it is around you all the time. If you're only there for 2 or 3 weeks, if you're only there for a month or 2 months, then you don't have to really adjust your way of dealing with things because you can still stay within your own mindset and not understand why they think the way that they think. Now, I've had this argument over and over again with people that have, oh, I traveled to the Ukraine, I've been to Russia. Sure, you visited there, but you didn't live there long enough to understand who they really were. And of course, I have lived in Japan and I've lived in Germany. And I've lived in Texas and Mississippi and Nebraska and Montana and California and Maryland. I've lived all over the United States, and I understand that people are different wherever you go. Adjusting to a life in a new culture is more likely to provide one with an additional perspective, and this appears to be associated with enhanced creativity. One reason that multicultural experiences foster creative thinking is that living in different cultures fosters a way of thinking called integrative complexity, a willingness and ability to acknowledge and consider different viewpoints on the same issue. And of course, that is the way it works. And there you go. That is the end of the chapter. Really kind of interesting, really kind of fun. If you want to understand another group, if you want to understand another culture, you have to live with them. You have to try to understand what they're talking about. And this is one of the reasons why I want you to read a book about another culture. And that's what your paper is supposed to be on. It's supposed to be, you don't have to have five references. You could just use the book that you're talking about. I want you to experience other cultures. One of the problems that we have if we've never lived anyplace else is that we think that our way of thinking is the only way to do things. If you are Dene and you've only lived on the reservation, then you can't imagine how indigenous people in Montana think. You can't imagine how people in Colorado think, how people in, oh, you know how people in New Mexico think, because, they're Dene. Well, not everybody, not all the indigenous people who live in New Mexico or Dene. Um, uh, People in Oklahoma, people in Texas. You, in order to understand other people, you need to understand where they're coming from, and that's one of the reasons why I want you to read a book about another culture, or a book. It doesn't even have to be. It can be fictional, because you can't really write about another culture unless you understand that culture. So anything that gives you a good idea of what that culture is all about. And then I want you to compare it with your own culture. The best way to learn about your own culture is to compare it with something that is different, to see how things are different. And so I'll see you next week. I think next week is week 8. We'll tackle chapter 8. This is a kind of a fun culture. This is kind of a fun chapter where we dealt with assimilation and integration and whatnot. So now I hope you understand a little bit more about how people think and how people work, and how these things have how it's not just the indigenous people that were forced to change the way that they think. It was all the immigrants that came into the United States, and about the only ones that weren't forced to change the way that they think were people from England, even the Irish, the Germans, the French, um, Scandinavians had to change their language. All of these people were forced to assimilate to the new American way of thinking. It had to do with democracy. Maybe they came from a monarchy. If you think of Europe, um, only France had a democracy. France and Switzerland, I guess, and Greece had one a long time ago, and the Low Countries, Netherlands, and Belgium, but not that many people immigrated from those places. So my point is that these people had to change their whole way of thinking, and they were forced to do this by going to school. So the schools that they went to were very similar to the boarding schools that indigenous people were forced to go to. Obviously, everybody didn't go to these schools because there are people on the reservation, older people on the reservation, that don't speak English, and they couldn't have gone to the boarding schools and kept their language intact. So we will talk more later. You can talk to me about this. You can tell me what a dumb person I am. And I'll see you next week.